We're going to keep talking about what we've basically been talking about this entire time, which is change. And specifically from a technological point of view, who's left behind? And I'm going to start with an example from my own country, from my country's Civil War. In March of 1862, two ships met off Hampton Roads, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. They shot at each other for an afternoon. Neither one did anything, and they left. From a purely tactical point of view, didn't change much. But from a global point of view, it revolutionized the entire world's navies and made them obsolete in a single afternoon. There had been the technology of plating ships with iron. There had been the technology of propelling them with steam engines. But no one had put them together for war. And suddenly, in one afternoon, every other ship around the world, warships built with the greatest cost and care, obsolete, Stone Age. It changed everything. It sent shockwaves through the timber industry. Coal, which was an economic resource, suddenly became a national security necessity. And suddenly, tiny parts of the world that were considered backwaters became vital national interests for coaling stations for the world navies. And if you dispute that, just ask the citizens of Belize and Hawaii. All changed because suddenly these technologies became what's called disruptive. And that's where I want to lead in. I want to talk about, we've talked a lot about technologies and what they're going to do, but I'd like each of you, if you can, to mention one specific world-changing technology that we face and what specific group might that technology leave behind. Who wants to jump in?
I think AI and machine learning has already been covered, but the issue here is just what the velocity is so fast, it's accelerating so fast. I believe it's exceeding people's ability to not only keep up, but even sort of internalize what's happening around their lives. And so I think that's one overarching thing that's going to be a major driver of social unrest, of economic dislocation, of enormous opportunity. The idea about unleashing this on the bottom, building a business from the bottom up. It's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. Okay? The cost of entry into markets is near zero. The social penalty for failure is near zero. But if you look at the bell curve, if you're sort of on the left side of that bell curve, a lot of people aren't going to be participating in that. And if you're on the right side of the bell curve, there'll always be people who says, oh, who moved my cheese, I'm scared of technology, or whatever. So the net result of that is likely to increase the division between the winners and losers in society.
Okay. So I think you have been talking before about AI for writing programs, right? And this technology has been around, if you think of evolutionary algorithms, genetic algorithms, for slowly evolving for the last probably 30 years. Yeah. And it's becoming more and more successful. And basically what it means that everyone who has an intuition, you don't need to learn to program, but you need to understand what a program does. Yeah. You need to understand how to define an optimization problem or a problem to solve in a way that, that those algorithms can design by. And those who are going to be able to do it are going to be able to create not one computer program, I don't know, in a month, in 2 months, in a year, but many a day, right? So you will be able to do those who understand how those programs work and how to, specifically how to define optimization problems, how to define the problems we deal with in a way those algorithms can work with. Those who are going to be able to do it are going to be exponentially more productive. And then those who are going to be left behind is basically all those of us who don't have an intuition for optimization problems, an intuition for computer programming, and basically all of us who didn't learn to code. You don't need to know to code in order to use that, but in the sense that we code every day, but we need to have done it enough in our lives to understand that, to have an intuition. Because when it happens, then all of us who have this intuition will be able to do so much more than the others.
this links a bit to the earlier panel as well, right, which talked about the importance of STEM education and programming skills. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I partially agree with that, partially not, because one of the things is that if you look at how code evolves or how coding languages evolve, the theory there is that as they evolve, they're gonna gradually start approximating human language. So we'll be able to program a system by giving it clear instructions, if the machine can take over the layer of abstracting and transforming into machine language. To me, the premise of the question, the core question, is actually quite wrong, because I don't think technology leaves people behind. I think people leave people behind. In a sense that, yeah, of course, I mean, for example, the ones of us that haven't learned to code or have invested that time, you know, they would probably be in a disadvantage, but then again, there are social structures and social systems to bring them back in, to re-educate them, to reskill them, etc. And of course, you know, I was thinking about from a perspective of virtual reality. Like, for example, if virtual reality becomes sufficiently advanced, people can choose to be escapist, in a sense that they would prefer the virtual world because it's better and gives them more. But that's a choice. And what I'm trying to say here is that the values that we teach our children and the choices that we make is what's going to leave us behind, not technology.
Well, what I mean specifically is it's not a guarantee that it will be left behind, but it is the potential. When we look at every new technology, we see an opportunity, but we also see a risk. And that's what I was asking is, when you see these new technologies, what do you see the risk of being left behind? We talked earlier in this earlier panel about alternative energy, which most of us embrace. We would love to have our cars powered by hydrogen. I don't think the oil companies are going to go quietly. I don't think the petrostates are going to go quietly. I don't think the millions of oil workers around the world or in my country are going to go quietly into the night. So that's why I'm specifically saying, what specific technologies do you see that could be wonderful opportunities, but could, if not managed, if not seen, could potentially leave groups of very scared, angry, hungry people in its wake?
I guess it's my turn to speak. Yes. I don't think that, I choose to have a bit more of an optimist approach towards the world. I think that we haven't seen the end of social media just yet. I think that it's actually a far more profound and deeper impact, is of far deeper impact than we actually think about it. Imagine, right now, I talked a little bit when I was speaking about the dichotomy that's going to happen between groups of people who are in different social networks. Imagine tying your social media network to your national ID, and to have everybody have a national ID. I think that the profundity of it is when you have a voice and you actually have a position in the world where you can get heard. I think that we haven't seen that percolate throughout the whole entire world just yet. We're seeing the potential. We're seeing it in small types of networks, and we're seeing it in different countries. But I think that we haven't seen the end of it yet, and I don't think the disruption has truly been felt fully just yet. We haven't explored the end of that technology. And I don't just mean about Facebook, I don't just mean about Twitter, I mean on the government scale. I think we haven't explored that at all, giving everybody an equal voice, giving everybody an opportunity to participate.
Fair enough. Did that prompt any other thoughts from any of the rest of you?
Yeah, I mean, the negative scenario could be, of course, I mean, combine the social media power together with the types of visual and audio manipulation that I mentioned. And then that can really leave a lot of people behind, because we're already being manipulated by, you know, fake news or fake statements. Imagine if those actually look and feel real.
I think there's another question, which is the governance question, in that if you go back and look at the founding documents of the United States, there was a great concern about not having a king or some sort of a ruler, but there's also a great concern about the power of the mob, if you will. And the point about representative government was set up in order to provide partly due to the communications network at the time, but also provide a sort of a check on mob rule. One of the things that's happened with the social media and the ability now is we're outstripping the ability of our governing institutions to address the problems that are being raised partly by technology, partly by our awareness of the technology. And the point, somebody made the point about what happens when you lose confidence in technology and self-driving cars. What happens if you lose confidence in the ability of your governing systems to address the social compact and the human needs of the population?
Cool. Should we open things up?
Yeah, let's open it up to questions.
Let's get some questions. Yeah. Peter Ho. Anyone else? Wendy Schultz. Anyone? We can take, let's say, all right, 3. Right, let's start with Peter, and then we can move along.
This is an observation and also a question to the panel, but it is a follow-up to the earlier this morning's session. And I think Lynn Wells hinted at the problem of velocity. But I think the issue for me is not velocity, which I think can be managed. The issue with technology is the issue of acceleration. So if you accept the premise that, as an example, computing power is accelerating based on Moore's law, doubling every 2 years or so, and a lot of the associated technologies are also accelerating, artificial intelligence and so on. You know, the kind of achievements you were seeing in artificial intelligence, which I think Victor spoke about, have only occurred in the last few years. And if technology advances at that kind of pace, then the question is, who will be left behind? And it's not just the people as a whole who might be affected by this. It is whether governments have that kind of agility to adapt to the rapid changes that are taking place. So we talk about ethics. Well, by the time we talk about ethics, there'll be new problems with artificial intelligence. And have we got our arms around the ethical issues of yesterday's AI problems rather than tomorrow's AI problems? Have we got the right kind of governance put in place to deal with or to manage the challenges of AI? And AI is only one of the types of issues. So really the question is, what's going to happen in a world of accelerating change? What's going to happen to governments? Will your nation states be so encumbered by current processes and current ways of doing things that they will not be able to keep up with the changes of technology? Will something new emerge? And I think this is something hinted at in this morning's session. Will the nation state, will there be a new Westphalian entity that emerges from it, or will something far more complex and far more untidy emerge? And then will the world be separated into those who have the ability to keep up and exploit these kinds of fast changes, and then will there be a much larger group of have-nots? So this to me is a most fascinating question, and it's just an observation, but I do not know whether the panel has any views and observations about it.
Great. So the second differential issue of acceleration and all of its attendant consequences. Wendy?
First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for their very interesting presentations, from which I have taken a lot, and I appreciate that. But I would like to challenge the panel's focus and design, because I have just sat listening with interest to 2 hours of a panel entitled The Future of Technology, and I think more accurately it could have been called The Potential Emerging Implications of the Extended Present of the Digital Age. And I was sort of surprised that there was only one mention of biological technological innovation. Thank you, Mr. Wells. I would add to brine a C, so BRINCE, which is a nice acronym, but you missed sort of cognitive neuroscience changes. And so given that, I pose a challenge to the speakers, please. If, setting aside your own personal and professional expertise in digital technologies, if as a person, what is the emerging technology in a field other than digital technologies, an emerging technology or innovation that you find most either exciting or unnerving, disturbing for the present? Thank you.
Yeah. Great. And one last one. Yeah, let's take yours as well. Can we have one more mic in front, please? This also gives our panel time to think about the extremely easy questions that have been posed to them so far.
Hi, thank you. I'm Willis from NSCS. Thank you very much for the panel. My question is somewhat similar to Mr. Ho's, but it pertains to laws and regulations regarding emerging, or shall we say, disruptive technology. I think most people today would acknowledge that laws as well as rules have not kept pace with the speed of technological advancement. If I remember my science fiction, I think Isaac Asimov had most famously the 3 laws of robotics. I'd like to pose to the panel what they feel are the most important laws or rules that should be put in place for these emerging technologies, specifically AI. Thank you.
Okay, so 2 questions on governance, right, around how exactly we deal with and legitimate technology in a world of greater acceleration, and then this issue of how come the panel did not boil the ocean, and can we talk about things other than digital? Fair question, but I also think whatever had happened in the panel, we would have been able to pose them that question. So would anyone like to take a first stab at this?
Well, I'll be brave.
Yeah.
Liran,
yeah.
So, my 2 cents on governance and governing those changes, and there are people in the audience that are far more savvy than myself. But I think first observation you see all around the world is that really states they don't keep up the pace of technology, and we see a more and more central place for the civil society in doing that. I think there are, and maybe to answer both questions, I think there are 2 questions that I would ask myself if I was in the place of government today. The first question is a question of ownership, in the sense that, to answer your first question, who is being left behind? Then if we think of the way those artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies evolve, is that they use data, right? And they use, eventually it's some kind of approximation of human behavior, and a lot of those algorithms work by getting data from us, from all of the people in the world about what they're doing, and then eventually there is an algorithm, and there is a know-how, and there is a technology that allows to do it instead of those people who just taught you how to do. So there was a question of ownership. We want to think who is left behind. It also said, okay, if we, all of us, gave the experience to those algorithms, what do we own in it, right? And that's a question that cannot be asked by anyone, it is not the government. And it is very much related to the question of who is left behind. Probably the ones who gave all the experience and the data, and then someone else is displacing them. Those are the people who are left behind. So that's one way to think. The second is, the usual way you would define a rule is what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And if you think of classic algorithms, many of them are defined the same way. You're doing some things. But if you think of the tasks or the algorithms you're seeing, and you were talking about opacity, we are not telling those deep neural networks what to do. We're telling them what to achieve. We're giving design principles. We're giving objectives. And I think starting to regulate that. So not, okay, you're allowed to do this or allowed to do that, but what is, for example, what is the training function? What is the reward function that we do not allow, or we do allow? And I think it's kind of thinking of design principles and thinking of targets we give to those learning algorithms. That's something I would put thought in.
Okay. So design principles rather than micromanaging specific outcomes.
And asking yourself not what the algorithm is doing and how it is working, because, but what are you training it for?
Yeah.
That's
okay. Who wants to jump in next?
So I think one of the things that's going back to Wendy's question here is one of the things that the fourth industrial revolution discussion talks about is actually the convergence of the physical, the biological, and the information worlds is having these profound changes. If you look at, for example, how much of biology today is biological neuroscience research is actually bioinformatics. And then you look at the amount of, we're already 3D printing implantable organs, implantable bladders, implantable orthopedic structures. People are working on kidneys and hearts. I had a conversation with a young person recently about, it was actually withdrawal of money out of retirement accounts. And the question was, what age should you set when you draw down all your money to avoid running out of money? And he said, well, this is 20-something. I said, I have every reason to believe I'll live to be 140. And so the question was, why? And so, well, the understanding of the clock-driven processes in the human body, telomerase, how cells divide, the ability to do trans-species growing of organs in pigs and things like that to implant into people, ability to print organs, a whole batch of things. And so what does it mean for all of our governance structures, social safety nets, all this kind of thing, if we can expect to live that long? So I mean, I think that, so I don't think it's just biology, it's the intersection of several technologies here. Going back to the governance, it seems to me that some kind of a mix of federated, distributed, localized mix. I don't think there's going to be any answer that's going to satisfy all the different needs and the point the man made about what are global rules for the internet and for information, but then what are things that can best be handled on a community basis? And how do you structure some sort of, because I don't think, as Peter said, the systems are never going to keep up with the velocity of technical acceleration, but you do a better job of keeping up with that within the communal society rules of dignity, justice, and fairness that you can work with, rather than trying to get some global system that homogenizes everything. So I think a distributed combination of global and local for governance.
Wendy, you brought up biology. I can tell you as a science fiction writer that is one of the pillars of science fiction is eugenics and how it deals with economics. And there are hundreds of stories that deal with the notion of once science has the ability to manipulate our codes, is that then reserved for the rich? Is that then reserved for the people who can afford to have stem cell research and to have the kind of genetic medicine that can make them healthy and make their babies born perfect? These are serious issues that need to be thought of. And when it comes into who is going to be left behind, when it comes to the rich and the poor, are we going to have a class of people, the global elite, the global rich, who can afford to have their babies genetically designed to be perfect, whereas the other 99% are just going to have big families, hoping that some of them will survive? These are things that must be considered.
So I guess the question is, why would you not think it will work out that way? What in human history suggests it would not work out that way?
Well, and that's an excellent point, and that goes to Peter's point about governments. The pillar of government, the foundation of any government, is legitimacy. Whether you are a tribal warlord leader in Somalia or whether you are sitting in the White House, is why are you the leader if you can't protect me, if you can't take care of me? And every government, no matter what type it is, needs to try to imagine the downside of any change. It's not inevitable, but it is possible. And if it is possible, it must be considered, as is the possible solution.
I'm going to approach it from a very Singaporean perspective because I'm very used to taking tests and exams. They ask a question, I must answer the question. So,
no Singaporeans were harmed in the production of this panel.
So to answer Wendy's question about what are the emerging technologies which I find the most disturbing, which are outside of my field of expertise, I personally find robotics very scary. I reached the uncanny valley very, very quickly. I was recently in Japan and I was walking along Harajuku, and a lot of the cutesy stores now actually have that robot that actually has the panel on the chest, and you can interact with it so that you can take a selfie so that it can take a selfie. I'm like, yeah, no. Makes me feel really uncomfortable. But I mean, I feel that the question that you've asked is fairly personal, so I don't know about the rest of you guys. Have you seen those before? What do you think? No? No?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, look at the panel. I find that disturbing. I think that the discussion about eugenics, I mean, I brought up the idea that cognitive developments are going to be something which we're looking into and we're not looking into at all because we don't know, we can't tell the future. And I think that that's something which we absolutely should be considering as a policy perspective when we're making policy for the future. Which actually brings me to both Peter and Willis's question about, will governments have the ability to manage the changes, the new challenges in technology? How are we going to legislate, for example, for AI? What are we going to be doing? I've got 3 responses. I think the first is that we actually do have laws and regulations already, which I find are fairly robust. Let me give you an example. I'm about 2 examinations away to finishing a, for fun, diploma in law, where we're learning about the law of tort. And it basically says who's responsible for the thing that happened. I know that the MAS has come up with a new regulation that I think is just drafted on the robo-advisory services. And the core thing of that discussion is really who's responsible if that robot or that algorithm gives you bad advice and you invest in a stock that's going to be worthless tomorrow. Who's responsible? So I think in primary legislation, I think we do have systems in place. Maybe it's the secondary delegated legislation that we may have some questions around. So that's my first point. The second point about what, I think it's more an application. What can governments do to make better decisions? One thing which I have faced time and time again on an APEC level, on an ASEAN level, is that we don't have enough data, which sounds a bit strange because we actually are suffering from a surfeit of data at the moment. Let me explain what I mean. We're looking at, for example, device users. When I go to an ASEAN discussion, when I go to an APEC level discussion, or when I get a journalist calling me, sometimes the question is, hey Mayan, how many people are using cloud computing now? And what's the cloud computing growth for the region? I said, I don't have that data because you're asking a strange question. If I were Dropbox, for example, I could tell you definitively how many people are using my service in this country, X country, provided that they give you the right information. But we're not tracking that numbers at this point in time. The World Bank Data Bank, for example, doesn't have those figures. ASEAN doesn't have those figures. Not just that, but we don't have proper figures on let's just take something very basic, mobile use. We do have systems where we can track subscriber use. But how many people in the audience, how many people are carrying more than 1 device with a SIM card with you right now? Some people have 2, some people have 3, some people have 4. So we don't know what these SIM cards are for. We don't have enough data to actually understand the implications of technology on each other's lives. What devices are you using? What OS are you on? I mean, simple questions that we don't quite have enough data in the first instance. So I feel that we need to come back and start collecting more information on this new digital divide. It used to be the have and the have-nots. Do you have an internet connection? Do you have broadband? But now it's about a knowledge divide. The New York Times, about a month ago, came up with this amazing, well, not amazing, but it was a really interesting read. The title was, Google is not a bird. Apparently there were these people who were going in India and they were giving out internet access to rural villages. And there was one guy who was telling all his friends, yes, internet's fantastic, I can do all of this stuff. And his father turned to him and said, is Google a bird? Hence the title. So we're not seeing enough data collection on this new digital divide. So that's the second point. My third point, and I'll end here, we'll need to consider the possibility of more omnibus laws, I think. We currently have sector-specific laws. I think we may want to consider the possibility of more omnibus laws. And I'll stop there.
Victor, any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, well, one of the points that I tried to make in my slides as well is that things move in cycles, right? And on the way up, it seems very fast and eternal going up, and on the way down, it seems very fast and eternal going down. And sometimes the cycles are long, so basically, the experience is almost like, is it ever going to be finished, you know? So what this cycle is about, one of the arguments that I'm trying to make, it is about data. The ubiquitous resource that drives whatever revolution is happening is about data as well. Even from a biological standpoint, it's about data about our biology. We're being vaporized into numbers and specs and metadata. So that's with regards to why I think where this is where the focus is. The next one may be about something else, but I'm not really sure that I understand enough to speculate. The second thing that I wanted to say is that when it comes to regulation, I think it's very difficult for government to look at industry and look at people and regulate them from the outside. In a sense that what my argument is that you need to have enough technologists, people with experience, people who build software inside when you're actually writing legislation, because otherwise you're basically writing a legislation for something you don't understand, which I think is a little arrogant. The third thing about data, I do think the data, we have it, it's just not consolidated, and for certain things we need to act proactively, which is another argument that I try to make before the data comes, because when the data comes it might be a little bit too late. I think a lot of us have seen the example of the weather predicting rock, because if it's wet, it's raining, if it's moving, it's windy, right? That's not sufficient because this is post-factum data, and data tends to arise after the fact. So we need to speculate a little bit and try to think a little bit ahead when we build legislation, because part of the issue here is exactly that things will happen fast, and then, of course, every revolution has a divide and creates a divide. Every time that there is some kind of a fast progress, people are left behind, and that, I guess, is okay. I think we're in the first time in a position where we can actually do something about it as a society, because of the information that we hold, because of the integration that we have in between our societies.
I think a lot of what you guys have said boils down to how we view the technology and whether it's radically new and utterly sui generis, or whether you kind of believe the whole nothing is new under the sun kind of philosophy, right? Which says this looks new, but there's stuff there that we can adapt and take from precedents and from prior experience. And of course, in the end, I suspect we will have to adopt what some people in both panels so far have called complex adaptive systems approaches, right? Approaches that are experimental and heuristic and that help us to recognize the emergent rules about these systems, even if they're not immediately apparent. Yeah, that, at least to me, at least seemed to be the subtext of what a lot of these responses were approximating towards. Let's have another round of questions. Sheila? And then gentleman right in front of you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Wilfried Wienhold from Egypt. And when listening to the development of these technologies and looking into how economies work today, you wouldn't disagree to the fact that today countries are proxies for markets, aren't they? So if these proxies exist and taking care of the economy, and now looking into the development, the rapid development of technologies, how do we make sure that, for example, just one example, the intellectual property rights keep pace with this type of development? It is like, if I may use this metaphorical analogy of water. Water doesn't know any boundaries. So, and I would assume it's the same with the digital technologies we are looking into it right now. So my question to the panel is, how are we going to make sure, not make sure, but how do we properly address the question of IPRs with the rapid development of technology, and also seeing that this type of development does not take care of boundaries so much?
I can speak to that as someone who makes a living from words.
Let's just hang on and get Sheila's question as well, and then we can have everyone respond to that. Yeah.
I would like to know how the panel feels about Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, and is there something we can learn from them with regard to public policy for not just national boundaries but global, the issues of how do you permit some city-states or states at all to create certain laws, but in a world of globalization they're meaningless unless you have some kind of global governance. So I guess my question is, what can we learn from Isaac Asimov's laws?
All right. So countries as proxies for markets. Why don't you kick us off, Max, and then we can just work our way
I can
down.
say that I make a living from intellectual property. I make a living from my books. And I can tell you that it's a huge issue of piracy. And sometimes, and the biggest problem with piracy in some countries, China's the big one. China is the main intellectual pirate. It's not the Chinese government, it's just individuals. Now, some ways you can counter that with technology. The reason that Hollywood now releases its big budget movies on 3D is because 3D cannot be pirated. So that is a way to ensure that at least you get a big opening weekend in the United States before suddenly they end up on DVDs in Shanghai. So technology is one way you can mitigate it. Another way is that you do have to press for stricter enforcement from the host country. That's the only way you can do it. I can tell you personally, in a strange way, piracy, it affects me financially, it hurts me financially, but in one way, it affected me in a positive way, because my books were banned in China. And the reason my books were banned in China was because I mentioned the Chinese government by name. Now in China, in the People's Republic, there's a very strict law that you cannot have a disaster happen in modern day China, because that implicitly indicts the Chinese government. It's saying that somehow the omnipotence of the Chinese government is not omnipotent anymore. So I was actually told, they said, change the name of China in your book World War Z, or it cannot be published on the mainland. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to change the name. Now, the advantage is my book was also being published in Taiwan. Now, what that means financially for me is there's probably a lot of World War Zs floating around China in Chinese that I ain't going to see a dime from. The advantage as an artist and as a free speaker and as a free thinker and someone who believes in freedom of speech is that my words are being read in China thanks to piracy.
So you could have written it in 3D format as well, Max, and that would have solved everything. Yeah. Irreplicable in that way. Anyone else on the rest of the
maybe
panel?
something about the IP from a startup's perspective. As you can guess, almost every startup that develops a technology, one of the first questions you're getting asked, an angel investor or something like that, is how do I protect my technology? I mean, a lot of the value of the startup is in what it will file patents for. And then obviously you have all the obvious answers that said, okay, you'll file a patent and you will get something. But really the true answer for me and what I usually tell startups is, well, if it's so easily reproducible, then maybe what you have is not that good. And the way to create things that are not easily reproducible is to have trained human capital and very, very high skilled people. So maybe the way that countries can help their people deal with IP theft is by making them more capable as human beings that write and develop technology. And because the more they will be advanced, the more difficult, and again, I'm not talking about fields like yours where the words are what you sell, right?
I'd like to think my books are that good.
But again, if some technology, if you can just read the patent and it's all you need, and it's that easy to reproduce, then maybe your human capital is not good enough. And I think that's what we should invest in, not more regulation.
So, two things. First of all, it's worth remembering perhaps that in the 1880s or whatever, Gilbert and Sullivan actually came to New York to have the first version of one of their operas produced in New York because they were so fed up with American piracy of their copyrights in Britain. So by producing the show first in New York, they locked in the American copyright. So I think we're somehow dealing with a never-ending problem here, an ongoing problem. But I wonder if blockchain can help in some respects here. If you actually could record either a transaction or a piece of IP or a part of a supply chain pedigree of a component with a distributed encrypted ledger that really would be fairly secure, might that help some of these problems?
Right.
I think that having a distributed ledger system would allow you to sort of have a footprint, a fingerprint that shows you that you're the first in line, but it doesn't really solve the problem of actual piracy because they might actually just simply pirate the idea. I was thinking, I like the question, the idea that countries are proxy for markets and how does IP keep pace with development. One of the things which I've always questioned, and I don't have an answer for this, one of the things which I've always questioned is the question of the ride sharing, about Uber, about Grab Taxi, about Grab, which is now called Grab. We have these companies which are coming out, and these are great ideas. And I mean, the IP itself could be the algorithm, could be the program. But the idea itself, this idea of ride sharing, it's not necessarily protected by IP. And if you're a country and you say, I want to make sure that my taxi industry, my public transport system is improved for the better, I mean, I have all incentive to either let people in or grow my own industry. So I think that there's a bit of a tension there, which again, I have no real answer for. I just like the fact that people are duking it out, and it's easy to get taxis right now than anytime
From a
else.
systems perspective, that's useful, right? Because you actually get a certain amount of contestability, and it's certainly the approach we've taken in Singapore to Uber and the taxi industry. I mean, neither side truly loves the other, and they are always minorly irritated with government. But I think overall, the system is healthier because of the different kinds of regulation that apply in each case.
Yeah, and I think that the government always is working for the purpose of the government is to work for the good of the people, in which case there is always going to be that little bit of tension with industry when it comes to that. So it's a bit of a question mark over there. About the question on what can we learn from Asimov's laws. So my studying for this particular session was that I went to revise what Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws were and what Asimov's laws were. So I'm very glad that people are actually raising it. It comes back to my earlier point about maybe we should have some omnibus rules and laws that oversee the entire legal system. I don't know whether a global system is going to work for us because, working on an APEC level and on an ASEAN level, I see problems on agreement there, and on the UN, it's a bit of trouble in getting, who's in charge, as Linton actually raised, who's the person who's going to lead these discussions. But maybe an omnibus laws like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics should be coming into play. That should be something that we should be putting on the books.
Can I push you a bit on that before we come to Victor? What's an example of what an omnibus law could look like? Because, again, you mentioned complex systems, several other speakers and questioners have as well. And one of the big ideas in complex systems is systems can be described by simple rules, right? So birds flocking can be described by a distance between each bird and the kind of proximity that they have, for instance. So what would an example of this simple heuristic or rule be in the case of an omnibus law?
So Liran actually brought up this point, and the idea that cybersecurity should be small again, should be simple, should be small again. I want to point to 2 very recently enacted legislation in Singapore, the Singapore Personal Data Privacy Protection Act, and the right now in public consultation Cybersecurity Act. They're enacted as omnibus laws. They are supra laws which basically will govern the rest of other legislation around data. And I think that that's something which we can consider. I don't know whether or not it can be distilled to the point of simplicity like Asimov's 3 laws, but perhaps that is something which we could possibly consider.
Okay, great, thanks. Victor?
Well, I come from Bulgaria, which is a country which, in the early 90s was, post-Soviet Union, low salaries, low income, high internet speeds. So I have very peculiar thoughts about intellectual property. One of those thoughts...
Do you have Max's book? Okay, don't answer that.
It is in Bulgarian.
Unfortunately, not yet.
Right. That is the right answer, I think.
I'll get you a Bulgarian copy.
I would love that. So where I was going with that is I've pondered a lot about that because at some point, for example, in my childhood, I amassed a lot of music, and then at some point later, I started earning proper money, so I started buying music actually. And then I started feeling a little bit of a dichotomy around, was that right and was that well? And then Spotify came about. My thinking was basically the best way to make bad behavior disappear is to design a system where it's just not rational. So with Spotify, so where I'm going with that is this: I think the best intellectual property, intellectual rights protection system is just a good, ingenious business model. I don't think that the business model that cinemas have for the last, 100 years is resilient enough. And I think that the fact that it's cracking is basically, it means it's time to go. I think that, for example, one of the interesting things that I found out about Spotify is that micro artists and artists in general are actually making much more money because of platforms like that. So I think it's time to ask ourselves the right questions and not just like try to protect whatever is left of an archaic system that doesn't really belong anymore.
There's also a bit of a question around, I mean, in the Spotify sense, there's a question around the equal distribution of income, because I think it's the bigger artists which are saying that, hold on, our profits margins are being eroded, but the smaller artists are actually earning some money. So in that sense, isn't that a benefit of technology?
Exactly. That's a good thing. I mean, I don't think that concentrating too much income in one place is a positive thing. So I applaud Spotify a system like that for such a thing. The second thing regarding laws, I think we really need to do a lot of work on that. And I think any opinion right now, especially opinion coming from science fiction, is not specific enough because of the dilemmas that can arise from a system you don't really understand and control. But one of the things that I think we need to really think about is who owns data. Because one of the things, so back to the point about business models, a lot of companies right now are making money off my data. I'm not making anything. I don't think this is fair. And here is also another challenge on intellectual property. So I think we need to think about these things. I think we really need to think about business model innovation and ownership.
I would also add that when we talk about legislation, we should talk about international legislation as well. Because in my country, we have right to privacy, which butts up against technology, which butts up against national security. We had an issue where the FBI tried to take on Apple. And Tim Cook in Apple, he said, "Oh, well, I'm not gonna let the FBI do this because it's about the privacy of our customers, and our customers come first. God darn it." Well, that's cute, but his iPhones are made in China. And what would he do if the Chinese government said to him, "Mr. Cook, we need a backdoor to track our dissidents, and you either build that backdoor today or tomorrow, the PLA is going to nationalize Foxconn. And while you take us to international court, within that time, when you're dickering and bickering, Samsung will eat you for breakfast." So there needs to be much more international cooperation, I think, when it comes to legislation, and can't just be restricted to the nation state.
I think there's also a question of law about what you deal with the outlier. And somebody pointed out that there are 2 million people in Seattle, say, and 1% of those are technological geniuses. That's 20,000 technological geniuses in Seattle. And let's say 1% of those are raving sociopaths.
Only one?
Well, so anyway, that's
between 1 and 5 years.
So you've got 200 raving sociopathic technological geniuses in one city with access not only to the global internet but home breweries where you can make God knows what in your basement for pathogens and things like that. And so how do you have a system of laws that provides protection for the broad majority, and yet I suppose we're getting this into terrorism tomorrow, but doesn't get so spun up by a couple of extreme cases that it really damages the entire case for everybody.
Cool. So I had we've got about 12 minutes left to this panel, and I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on the theme of utopia and dystopia, which many of you will have noticed kind of runs through all the different panels. We've picked speakers some of whom address more dystopian elements, some of whom address more utopian elements. And as I was listening to all four of you, I was very strongly reminded of a few different science fiction writers, not just Isaac Asimov, although he certainly did come up. But I was thinking a lot about Aldous Huxley, right, who really, if you had to summarize Brave New World, it's the fact that humanity gets destroyed by the things that delight it. Right? All the things we enjoy and that entertain us become the things that destroy us. In George Orwell's case, the utopia and dystopian line came from the things that we fear the most. If you read Ray Bradbury, actually a lot of the things that destroy humanity are the things that minorly irritate us. Right? Those daily things that just end up becoming all-encompassing. And then, I know this isn't strictly science fiction, but I'm taking moderator's license. If you read Tolkien, a lot of the destruction there comes from the burdens that we bear, but the burdens also have a redemptive element, right? So they turn dystopias into utopias rather than the other way around. And the reason I bring up these archetypes is I was curious for all four of you, and this can be the point on which we end today's panel, I think. What do you think is going to be the kind of thing that we as humans should either fear or welcome? Is it the things that delight us, the things that we are already afraid of? Is it the things that minorly irritate us? Or is it the burdens that we bear? Or some other category entirely because you've read some other science fiction writer and you'd like to show off now? It's a big question, but I thought it'd be a nice one to end off on.
So there was a great line at DEF CON, the hacker convention 2 years ago, that said, basically, be careful what you're afraid of. Because in the United States, 8 times as many people every year are killed by cows as are killed by sharks. But you don't have Cow-NATO week on...
And we're not talking American beef here, right? We're actually talking
right.
cows.
So I think part of the issue is you can get spun up easily in the social media argument and whatever about an issue that may or not be the core one. I mean, it seems to me that the two really critical things here is there some sort of a mass destruction pathogen, somewhere in the biogenetic revolution, that somebody could produce that really would exterminate a large part of the human race? And the other question is all the artificial intelligence, whatever, leading us to a world where we're not quite human anymore? And those are the two things then.
Okay.
Well, I grew up with Terry Pratchett, so one of the things that he taught me is basically that life has a very funny sense of sarcasm and irony. So the thing that worries me the most is the fact that we get so boggled down into whatever we think that it's important that we forget about everything else. I think one of the things that's very important for us as a species is, progress is really nice, it's really good. We need to also probably spread out because, being in one place kind of provides risks, which is, if you look at pale blue dot at the beginning is wonderful because it shows you how we have this drive to explore, but that drive to explore is driven by the drive to survive. And I think that my biggest fear right now is that we've created an environment, or we're creating an environment, we're working towards creating an environment that we can entirely control, which means that it's contained, which means that it's not going to expand our world. And that's a bit of a problem because if you accept that anything that can be imagined has been imagined, and you put all these, surround yourself with all these models, put yourself down in a virtual reality, it doesn't really look far from the movie The Matrix.
Yeah.
And that kind of bugs me. So I would like to push ourselves to explore both in depth but also in breadth,
right.
and take everything with a grain of salt and a bit of sarcasm.
Nice. Right. So expand the view of the universe, expand the view of the system. Yes, but remember that something somewhere is laughing at us.
Exactly.
Great. Liran, may I?
I think I will go a little bit with Tolkien. In Judaism, there is a saying that freedom is the ability to see the same thing from both its sides, and that's where freedom is. And I come from a field that usually is associated with fears and horrors, right? I mean, no one ever heard cybersecurity guys say anything positive about the world, but
until today.
But
yes.
But still, I think that interesting breakthroughs also in this field are when you're starting not only to say, oh, there is a big thing, big scary threat, let's go take care of it, but say, okay, what is this threat saying about the system as a whole? And looking at cyber threats and generally those fears as indicators for cracks in the systems, for potential problems, not only in the technology, but in the way we engage with the human beings, and then go and fix it in a broader way. And we have only 6 minutes left, but there are some examples of things that started as cybersecurity, for example, and led, for example, to a better stability of servers, efficiency, stuff like that. That's a rather stupid example. Or there are programs where I come from that, by training people in cybersecurity, induce social mobility, because those people come from underprivileged background, and now they have bigger salaries because salaries in cybersecurity are good. So there are many kind of way to look at it, but I will go for that one. We see all those threats, but not let's just focus on, okay, we're going to take care of this threat and this threat, but what does it say about us in general, about society, about technology in society, and try to use it as a leverage or as a beginning for a greater repair of our problems.
Great. So coming to things from a position of curiosity, so to speak, right? What data the world is actually showing us based on these technological changes. The one challenge, I guess, and this is the public policy side of me coming out, would be sometimes we don't have a lot of time to appreciate all of that, but we need nonetheless to respond. And how do we then calibrate those responses such that they're adequate, but also give space for more information to come out later on?
Well, thanks to the robot, you will have more time to think.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Maniam, we get you the last word.
Like I mentioned, I tend to take a very utopian view. I prefer personally to take a utopian view of the world and the future. But my fear is actually not about the dystopia or the utopia, but about entropy. Let me explain what I mean. Neil Postman, and I cut my teeth on Asimov and Pratchett as well. Neil Postman has a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. My fear is that we've created all of these, Spotify, we've got YouTube, we've got Netflix, and I'm just afraid of people not caring too much already. I run a public policy, ICT public policy course in the National University of Singapore, and an increasingly diminishing number of people are actually coming into the class because people are like, this is not really important. I mean, we don't really care too much. I know. Aaron is like, what?
Troubles me greatly.
And because people don't really care, they're like, let me talk about the impact of Facebook. Let me talk about the impact of, no, this is not something which is really interesting. I just want to use it. And therefore, in Neil Postman's words, we might actually end up amusing ourselves to death. That plus the fact that I personally feel that network economies actually favor monopolies. It's actually easier to have one company take care of everything and then reduce the cost of, for example, network access for people. That actually is an economics term. That plus the fact that we might want to amuse ourselves to death, plus the possibility of the utterly random coming in, like an asteroid hitting the Earth and then we all die. I mean, I find that the reality of the situation is a bit more dire than I would like to feel, but that's my opinion.
Right. The good bit, of course, is that the utterly random, short of the major asteroid, right? A lot of it, as we talked about earlier, and here we're going back to where the day started, actually, right? So many of those black swans are actually black elephants in disguise. And we may think they are utterly random, but a lot of the evidence for them lies out there in weak signals, in the whispers of tomorrow, that we are not as rigorous as we could be in terms of detecting or at least acknowledging where we are at now. Max, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I would call myself a wary optimist, because I think to be a pure utopianist, I think you get into. Does anybody ever heard of Francis Fukuyama?
Sure.
Anybody, you guys know him?
Us,
yeah, right. He's an idiot. Because at the end of the Cold War, he called it the end of history, as if we were in a wonderful new age. Well, yeah, we might have been in a new age, but we're still the same species. We still have the same wants, fears, hatreds, ignorance, joys, loves. We're able to dream. We're still human beings. And that doesn't change. And I think that if we are to go forward, we need to acknowledge our darker side and to manage it and to plan for it. And only by doing that, I think that we can move forward. I mean, the success story of Singapore is not the buildings that we see outside. It's the fact that when it became independent, that these different ethnic groups didn't all tear into each other like the former Yugoslavia or like Rwanda. That somehow Singapore has found a way to live together and make this work. And I come from a very similar country. We are not a nation state. We are not Iran or Japan. We are not a homogenous group. We are a bunch of patchwork mutts that all came together that chose to live under ideals. Have we lived up to those ideals? No. But we are continuing to live up to them. I'm proud to say that I come from a country where our last president could have been a slave of our first president. That's how much progress we have made in barely 200 years. And it gives me hope for the human race. I think that we can continue to move forward and build a better world and always be aware of the steps we are taking up towards the light of where we want to be.
Well, I don't think it gets more optimistic than that. That didn't sound very weary at all, actually, Max. But maybe we can hear the weary version over coffee and dinner later on. But let's wrap this up. Thank you very much to our 4 panelists.